At first, the reports didn't make sense. In a dimly lit headquarters far behind the front, Axis staff officers stared at maps covered in pins and grease pencil lines that were supposed to tell a familiar story. Enemy advances should slow. Supply columns should thin out. Fuel shortages should force pauses. Roads should clog. But the lines kept moving. Day after day, American units advanced, not in dramatic bursts, not in reckless lunges, but with a steady, almost mechanical persistence that defied everything German and Japanese planners believed about modern war. Reconnaissance photos showed endless truck columns. Intercepted messages spoke of ammunition arriving on schedule, fuel depots refilled overnight, damaged vehicles replaced as if losses barely mattered. Officers trained to think in terms of decisive battles began to realize they were watching something far more unsettling. The Americans were not improvising. They were not gambling. They were executing a system. Every destroyed bridge was bypassed or rebuilt. Every shattered road was repaired. Every exhausted unit rotated forward while fresh supplies and reinforcements flowed in behind it. There was no dramatic climax, no visible breaking point to exploit. The enemy simply did not stop. For the first time, some Axis analysts began to understand the danger they were facing. You could plan to counter a tank. You could design defenses against aircraft. But how do you fight an opponent whose real weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, but an industrial-scale supply chain that never seems to run dry? That unsettling question hung over every subsequent report, because the Americans were proving something terrifying in real time. Wars are not only won by who fights harder or who has better weapons. They are won by who can keep moving when logic says they should have stalled. And to understand why entire American armies advanced without slowing down, we first have to understand the assumptions Axis intelligence got disastrously wrong from the very beginning. Chapter 1. Thesis. What this story proves. From the outside, the war appeared to be a contest of tanks, planes, ships, and soldiers. That was how most military intelligence organizations were trained to see it. And that was how Axis planners measured American strength. They counted divisions. They tracked aircraft production. They estimated ship losses and replacement rates. On paper, it all looked manageable, even impressive, but not decisive. What they failed to grasp was that the real contest was happening far from the front lines, in places no reconnaissance aircraft could fully capture, and no battlefield report could properly summarize. This story is not about a single battle or a single commander. It is about a misunderstanding so deep that it shaped every major Axis decision once American forces entered the war in full force. Axis intelligence believed that logistics were a constraint, a limiting factor that would eventually slow the Americans just as it slowed everyone else. They assumed that long distances, damaged infrastructure, and the sheer friction of war would impose natural pauses. In their minds, momentum was temporary, culmination was inevitable. Every offensive, no matter how powerful, had a breaking point. The United States shattered that assumption. American planners did not treat logistics as a background function. They treated it as a primary weapon. Movement was not something to be hoped for after victory. It was something to be guaranteed before battle even began. The ability to move men, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food continuously was not an accident of abundance. It was the result of deliberate design. Axis intelligence, focused on firepower and battlefield tactics, never fully adjusted to that reality, and that failure had consequences that went far beyond miscalculations on a map. Because once you misunderstand what actually limits your enemy, every plan you build on that misunderstanding becomes a trap. To see how this error took root, we have to look at the mental model Axis planners used when they tried to imagine how the Americans would fight, and why that model seemed reasonable at the time. Chapter 2. The Axis assumption. Axis intelligence did not arrive at its conclusions out of ignorance. Their assumptions were built on hard experience. German and Japanese officers had watched modern armies grind to a halt under the weight of their own supply demands. They had lived through campaigns where fuel shortages froze armored formations in place, where ammunition rationing dictated tactics, and where damaged rail lines turned victories into stalemates. In Europe, distance was an enemy. In the Soviet Union, it had been a killer. In the Pacific, islands starved garrisons into defeat. Logistics, in Axis thinking, was the invisible ceiling that no army could break through for long. From that perspective, the American challenge appeared familiar. Long sea lanes stretched across oceans. Ports would be limited. Roads would bottleneck. Rail networks would be sabotaged. Mechanized forces would outrun their supply trains, just as German panzers had outside Moscow and Japanese formations had across China. The larger the army, the more fragile it would become. Size, they believed, was a liability waiting to be exploited. Axis planners expected the Americans to surge forward, then pause, then struggle. That pause was where counterattacks would succeed and defensive lines would stabilize. What Axis intelligence consistently underestimated was not American courage or even American industry. It was American organization. They evaluated U.S. power using European constraints and continental assumptions, applying old limits to a system that had been built specifically to ignore them. They measured divisions instead of depots, tanks instead of truck fleets, firepower instead of throughput. The Americans were not planning to win by reaching farther than logistics allowed. They were planning to redefine what logistics allowed in the first place. This difference in thinking mattered enormously, because while Axis planners waited for the moment when American advances would naturally slow, U.S. forces were moving according to a very different logic, a logic that did not rely on pauses, did not expect culmination, and did not leave momentum to chance. And that logic began to reveal itself the moment American armies hit the ground and kept going, powered by something the Axis had never learned how to properly see. Chapter 3. America's hidden weapon, the system. What Axis intelligence struggled to see was that American logistics was not a collection of support units reacting to events at the front. It was a system designed to function continuously, regardless of friction, damage, or loss. From the moment U.S. forces entered the war, logistics was treated not as an afterthought, but as an operational priority equal to combat itself. Every movement plan began with a simple question: how do we keep everything moving tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that? Behind the front lines, the American war effort looked less like a traditional army and more like an industrial process in motion. Ports were organized to unload at relentless speed. Supplies flowed into depots that were laid out with efficiency in mind, not elegance. Trucks moved in endless columns, standardized vehicles carrying standardized loads, driven by soldiers trained to think in terms of schedules and tonnage rather than heroics. When vehicles broke down, repair units fixed them quickly or replaced them entirely. When roads failed, engineer units appeared almost automatically, filling craters, laying bridges, and reopening routes with practiced speed. Standardization was the quiet genius of the system. Parts fit where they were supposed to fit. Fuel types were simplified. Ammunition was packaged for rapid handling. This reduced delays, confusion, and the cascading failures that normally cripple large armies. Losses were expected, planned for, and absorbed without disrupting the overall flow. Instead of slowing advances, damage became just another variable the system was built to handle. To Axis observers, this looked unnatural. Armies were supposed to struggle as they moved forward. Supply lines were supposed to stretch and snap. But the Americans had built a logistics machine that treated distance as a problem to be solved, not a fate to be accepted. And once that machine was fully engaged, it began producing something the Axis had never anticipated: momentum without exhaustion. A conveyor belt of combat power that did not pause, did not regroup, and did not wait for the enemy to recover. Chapter 4. The first shock. The pace never breaks. The first real shock came when Axis commanders waited for the slowdown that never arrived. After landings, after breakthroughs, after heavy fighting, there should have been a lull. Units should have paused to refuel. Artillery should have waited for ammunition. Damaged vehicles should have piled up along the roads. Instead, American formations kept advancing with an unnerving regularity. When frontline units slowed, fresh ones appeared. When roads clogged, alternate routes opened. When depots were bombed or shelled, new supply points emerged farther forward, as if the rear had simply shifted overnight. Axis reports began to reflect confusion rather than analysis. Officers noted that American units seemed unconcerned with losses of equipment. Trucks destroyed by air attack were replaced. Tanks knocked out were hauled away and new ones rolled forward. Ammunition expenditure, which should have forced restraint, appeared almost unlimited. Even under pressure, American units continued to fight aggressively, not because they were reckless, but because they knew more was coming. Confidence flowed directly from logistics. What made this especially disturbing was the psychological effect. Axis doctrine assumed that pressure created exhaustion. Exhaustion created hesitation. Hesitation created opportunity. But the Americans inverted that logic. Pressure did not slow them down. It accelerated their systems. The harder they pushed, the more their logistics expanded to support the push. Momentum became self-sustaining. The enemy was not pausing to regroup. They were rotating forward on a schedule. By the time Axis commanders realized that the pace itself was the weapon, it was already too late to adjust. Defensive plans built around the expectation of natural pauses collapsed one after another. The Americans weren't racing toward a breaking point. They were advancing on rails, powered by a machine designed to make stopping optional. And soon, the implications of that reality would become impossible to ignore, as entire armies began moving forward without slowing down at all. Chapter 5. The moment it became obvious. Whole armies advance without slowing. There comes a point in every campaign when expectations collide with reality so violently that denial is no longer possible. For Axis intelligence, that moment arrived when the usual killers of offensives failed, one after another. Fuel shortages did not freeze American units in place. Instead, gasoline arrived in bulk, moved forward as aggressively as the combat troops themselves. Ammunition consumption, which should have forced caution, became irrelevant as new stockpiles appeared closer to the front. Even spare parts, the quiet enemy of mechanized armies, never seemed to dictate tempo. Broken vehicles vanished to the rear and reappeared repaired, or were replaced outright, without slowing the advance. Infrastructure destruction, long considered a reliable brake on momentum, lost its power. Bridges were blown, but engineers rebuilt them. Roads were cratered, but bypasses emerged. Rail lines were severed, and within days, they were functioning again, sometimes while fighting continued only miles away. Medical evacuation, another traditional point of collapse, worked with chilling efficiency. Wounded soldiers disappeared rearward, and replacements flowed forward, preserving unit cohesion and morale. The front did not hollow out. It renewed itself. Axis officers began to describe American movement in terms that bordered on disbelief. Entire formations advanced as if tethered to an invisible engine. Losses that would have crippled any other army became accounting entries rather than operational crises. The Americans were not winning by avoiding friction. They were winning by overwhelming it. Their system absorbed shock, damage, and loss without losing rhythm. This was the moment when the war stopped being a contest of maneuvers and became a contest of endurance that only one side could win. The Axis could still fight. They could still inflict casualties, but they could no longer dictate tempo. The Americans set the pace, and the pace never slackened. Once that truth became clear, the strategic picture changed permanently. The question was no longer whether American advances could be halted, but how long resistance could be maintained before the weight of uninterrupted movement crushed everything in its path. Chapter 6. Why Axis intelligence missed it. The failure was not a lack of data. Axis intelligence had reports, aerial photographs, captured documents, and frontline observations. The problem was interpretation. They looked at American logistics through the lens of their own experience, assuming that the same constraints that had crippled German and Japanese operations would eventually apply to everyone. This kind of mirror imaging is one of the most dangerous habits in intelligence work, and in this case, it proved fatal. They assumed America would fight like a bigger version of themselves, not like a fundamentally different system. Axis analysts focused on what was easiest to count: divisions, tanks, aircraft, shipping losses. These were tangible, visible, and familiar. Logistics, by contrast, was dispersed, boring, and difficult to summarize in a single report. The scale of American trucking capacity, the depth of its maintenance units, and the sheer number of trained logisticians never registered as decisive factors. When those details did appear, they were treated as background noise rather than the main signal. There was also an institutional bias at work. Combat arms dominated prestige within Axis militaries. Logistics was necessary, but it was not glamorous. Officers who specialized in it rarely shaped grand strategy. As a result, intelligence organizations mirrored those values. They searched for decisive weapons and breakthrough tactics, not for systems that guaranteed continuous movement. By the time it became obvious that logistics itself was the decisive weapon, the realization came too late to change anything. This misjudgment locked Axis strategy into a losing pattern. Plans were built around pauses that never came. Counterattacks were timed for moments that did not exist. Defensive lines were drawn with the assumption that the enemy would eventually slow down on his own. But the Americans had removed that assumption from the equation entirely. And once that became clear, the consequences extended far beyond any single battlefield, reshaping the entire war in ways that could no longer be reversed. Chapter 7. The real consequence. Once it became clear that American armies could advance without slowing down, the nature of the war itself changed. Tactical skill still mattered. Courage still mattered. Individual battles were still fought and won or lost. But strategy tilted decisively toward the side that could sustain pressure indefinitely. When one army can replace losses faster than the other can inflict them, time stops being neutral. It becomes a weapon. For the Axis, this meant that even successful defensive actions carried a hidden cost. Every delay achieved by hard fighting consumed irreplaceable men, vehicles, and fuel. Every counterattack weakened the force needed for the next line of resistance. Meanwhile, the Americans returned stronger after each engagement, not because they were flawless, but because their system was built to recover faster than damage could accumulate. Attrition no longer favored the defender. It favored the side that could keep moving. The strategic consequences were brutal and unavoidable. Once American logistics were fully established, the question was no longer whether Axis forces could hold ground indefinitely. They could not. The question became how much destruction would occur before the inevitable collapse. Every mile of territory defended was paid for twice, once in blood at the front, and again in the slow erosion of an army that could no longer replace what it lost. At that point, resistance became a matter of delay rather than victory. And delays, no matter how heroic, could not reverse a system designed to function without exhaustion. The war had entered a phase where outcomes were determined not by bold maneuvers or brilliant tactics, but by arithmetic. And the arithmetic was unforgiving. Chapter 8. The wider lesson. What this story ultimately reveals is that the most decisive advantages are often the least dramatic. Logistics does not inspire speeches. It does not produce heroic last stands or iconic photographs. Yet it shapes outcomes long before those moments ever occur. The Axis focused on what they could see and measure easily: firepower, formations, battlefield success, while missing what truly mattered: the ability to absorb shock, recover instantly, and continue operating without pause. This failure was not unique to the Second World War. It is a pattern that appears whenever organizations confuse visibility with importance. Systems that reward bold declarations over honest assessment and dramatic action over sustained capability eventually lose contact with reality. The Americans did not win simply because they were richer or larger. They won because they built a structure that assumed friction, planned for loss, and removed chance from the equation as much as possible. By the time Axis leaders understood this, the lesson came at the worst possible moment. They were facing an opponent whose strength did not peak and fade, but accumulated. An opponent whose setbacks were temporary and whose advances were permanent. The war was no longer about stopping a breakthrough. It was about confronting a process that could not be reversed once it was fully in motion. And that realization leads directly to how this story ends. Not with a single decisive battle, but with a slow, grinding certainty that once movement becomes unstoppable, outcomes follow whether anyone is ready for them or not. By the time the war reached its final stages, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The decisive factor had revealed itself not in one dramatic moment, but in thousands of small, unglamorous actions repeated day after day without interruption. Entire American armies advanced not because they were unstoppable in battle, but because they were unstoppable in motion. Axis intelligence had looked for a pause that never came, and by the time they accepted that it never would, the war had already been decided. Stories like this remind us that history is often shaped by forces that operate quietly in the background, long before the headlines are written. If you found this perspective on the war valuable, thank you for spending your time with us. This is Witness to War, where we explore not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like it. It helps more people discover the channel. Subscribe to Witness to War for more deep dives into the hidden mechanics of history, and share this video with anyone who loves understanding how wars are really won. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was the most underrated factor of the Second World War? Leave a comment and join the conversation. Thank you for watching.